Welcome to another episode of InstaBlinks. I'm your host, Brian Graff, and today we have Paul Brebner, open source technology evangelist here at InstaCluster, back on the show again to talk about architecting applications with multiple open source big data technologies. Paul, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Oh, yes, hi, thank you very much for the introduction, Brian. I'm the open source technology evangelist with InstaCluster. I've been here about 7 years and I live in Canberra.
Awesome. So the reason we're having this InstaBlinks here is to talk about the Community Over Code in Bratislava, the Community Over Code EU that you went to. You had several presentations. You also gave a keynote talk for the data engineering track, if I remember that correctly. What was that about?
Yeah, no, it was about everything, which is quite a challenge in 30 minutes, and it could be a bit tricky also in a short video overview such as this. But yeah, essentially I was talking about everything I've used and have learnt in 7 years building demo applications with open source technologies at InstaCluster, and relating that to the data engineering audience as well. So yeah.
How do you feel like that was received? You and I talked about this a little bit afterwards, and you were a little surprised at the turnout or the amount of interest. Dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, it was the keynote talk, so I guess I was lucky being the first one up. That always gets a large audience. They're coming to check out what the track is about, and I was very pleased that they'd selected my talk as the keynote talk. So that was good in terms of numbers and also feedback as well and interest.
Awesome. So with that talk, what type of technologies did you use? Were they all open source? And why did you choose each of them?
So that's a good question. Yes, all of them absolutely were open source, or at the time when I used them, they were open source. Things have changed a bit for some of them. And yeah, I picked them primarily because they're ones that I've actually used. I have come across other open source technologies in the last 7 years, but these are ones that I've actually used to solve real use cases. So I've got some first-hand experience with them, and I've written about them and have given talks. So this talk was sort of a summary of all of my blogs and all of my talks that I've given. And yeah, the way I approached it basically was I just took them in chronological order from the oldest one that I've used through to the most recent one.
What would you say were the top technologies that you chose to include?
Well, okay, so some of them are Apache project technologies, and I guess you could, that's one answer to that question. So they included Apache Cassandra, Kafka, Camel, Spark, Lucene, and Superset, plus a few slightly older ones, Zookeeper, Curator, and Zeppelin. They're a bit old now. We actually do still provide Apache Zookeeper as a managed service, but that's a pretty old technology and it's no longer used by Apache Kafka, for example. So yeah, they were the highlights in terms of the Apache technologies, but there were plenty more as well.
Okay. And how did you weave those together? And that's a lot of technologies to talk about in a 30-minute session. So, what did you talk about and how did that kind of integrate together?
Yeah, so there were a number of different ways to do this. And the way I was originally going to do it was by category of technology. So some broad categories were things like storage and databases. So Cassandra fits in with that pretty well. Streaming, Kafka fits in that category pretty well. And then sort of more complex transformation processing technologies, including Spark, for example, and Kafka Streams. And then some development tools like Zeppelin, Jupyter, and Zookeeper, and some of the tools you actually need as a developer to build real applications and make them run. And finally, observability. So tools like Prometheus and Grafana, and Open Telemetry, which is the newer standard, and visualization. I shouldn't forget visualization. That's important to building an application to be able to actually see the results, particularly in a data engineering pipeline where you're trying to transform raw data into something that's got far more insight and value than the raw data. So, for example, Superset is a good tool to use for visualization. So that's the category approach. What I actually did in practice was really just look at each one briefly, chronologically, and look at the superpowers that each technology had, and also some of the use cases that I've used them with, and which technologies they worked well with, and then some things to watch out for as well, because not everything is as straightforward as you would like.
So shrinking down a 30 minutes talk into, several minutes here, if we were to do a 101 session for viewers who've who are interested in, architecting some of these applications, walk us through where they would start and kind of your thought process of, maybe four of those technologies and how they would integrate together.
Okay. I guess maybe I'll just focus on some of the use cases, perhaps. So one of the early use cases I built was a large, very scalable anomaly detection system. So that used multiple technologies by design, because we wanted to show off some of the technologies and how much you could actually scale some of those. So that included Kafka and Cassandra, and then we ran the application code on Kubernetes on AWS. And in order to understand what was going on in the system and debug it and optimize performance and scalability, we also used Prometheus and Grafana for monitoring, and what was then called open tracing for distributed tracing. That's now morphed into a new standard called open telemetry, which is a lot better. So that's one example. Another use case that I looked at one point was building zero code data pipelines. So that was streaming data from a variety of source systems through Kafka Connect into a variety of sync systems and visualizing the results. So that worked pretty well with Kafka, Kafka Connect, Kafka Streams, and a variety of sync systems, including OpenSearch and Postgres, plus Apache Superset to visualize the data. Oh, and Apache Camel. So Apache Camel works really well. It's got a huge variety of open source Kafka connectors available. So you can basically use those to connect anything to anything via Kafka Connect. More recently, open telemetry with Kafka and Kafka Streams is a really good way of visualizing complex distributed topologies. So that's a good combination of technologies. And also a new technology that we've started offering recently is Uber's Cadence. That's a workflow engine. It's designed as a code as workflow engine. It's a bit different to some of the other technologies around, like Airflow, for example. But that works really well with Kafka and also TensorFlow if you want to do some interesting streaming machine learning. And the use case I used that for was a simulated drone delivery system. So that was a fairly interesting use case that I've talked about at quite a few conferences recently as well.
That's fantastic. So as you're piecing these applications and architecting all this together, do you find that everything integrates fairly easily together, or what are some of the pitfalls or gotchas that you run into as you start patching together 6, 7, 8 different technologies?
Yes, look, it would be nice to say there were no issues at all, but part of the talk was actually about architecture, and to me, architecture is all about integration, interoperability, non-functional attributes like performance and scalability, error handling, and observability, and you have to have all that in order for these sorts of systems to actually work well together. So one of the issues with some of these big data technologies is scalability, both within the systems and across multiple systems. So for example, with Kafka, you need to watch out for the number of petitions that you have, and watch out for slow consumers, which can push up the number of petitions and increase the end-to-end latency beyond what you can cope with. And then if you're trying to integrate some of these technologies, particularly maybe even using Kafka in the middle, you have to then deal with scalability across multiple different systems, and they all scale at different rates and in different ways, and you have to be able to monitor that to see where the bottlenecks are, and if something is slowing down, if there's a backlog of processing in part of the system. So that was quite tricky, particularly some of the data pipelines that I built with different sync systems that were going at processing data at a different rate to what Kafka could do and what was actually coming into the system as well. Error handling, things never always work perfectly all the time. I was quite surprised with the pipeline system I built. It worked perfectly for about a week, and then it just failed. So there was obviously something going wrong, and I'd forgotten to put the right sort of error handling into that. So that's something else you have to worry about as well. Machine learning over streaming data is actually an interesting use case that's becoming very common, but it is actually quite tricky to do. The streaming data is in real time, and you can get something called concept shifts, which means the data actually changes rapidly at a particular point in time. But because you're actually learning in real time as well, it's very hard for the machine learning algorithm to know what to do. Should it throw the model out that it's got currently? Should it start from scratch? Should it try and incorporate some of the previous data? What should it do? And it's actually quite hard to do machine learning over streaming data, but it's a challenging and interesting use case. So yeah, there's a few examples of some of the sort of high level issues that you can come across, but they're all solvable. You just have to be aware of them.
And if people want to learn more, you've written up a lot of blog posts and thoughts about these different use cases. Where can they find more about these different technologies and use cases that you've been talking about?
Yeah, everything I know is essentially in my blogs, not in my head. So yeah, instacluster.com/Paul-Brebner is me. I've got probably 110 blogs published there, plus a lot of other material on the web as well. So yeah, there's a lot there, and everything that I talked about in this talk is there in more detail. Some of the material's a bit out of date now, so just watch out for that. Some technologies have changed quicker than others.
Awesome. Well, Paul, thank you for joining me today on this InstaBlinks. This is it for this episode. And for all of you, I wish you the best. Until next time, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very much.